Hi, I'm Ishan. I design satellites at Pixxel Space, so thanks for having me. I'm just going to cover a couple things in today's presentation. So quickly going through this. First off, why spaceflight? Just fundamentally why I believe in this goal and why it's important as a civilizational pursuit for us. Why Pixxel? Just a touch upon the kind of work we do there and what we've been doing with hyperspectral imaging. Where AI comes in, this is a AI lab, so decided to feature some of that in. But just touching on the AI applications in space and where it's eventually going to go, and the crazy sci-fi future. And this will, I think, be some of the bulk of that presentation, where I really want to touch on what our long-term aspirations look like in spaceflight as a species and where this eventually goes. Very important for us that even though this is our starting point out on this spec, it's important that we take these civilizational backups, right, and make sure that we have a arm out there in the rest of the universe. It is somewhat of an inevitable possibility if you have the capability, and yet while you have the capability, you just need to make that possible while we can. One of my favorite images, the other pale blue dot. This is not the original. This is from Cassini in 2013, but I like this one better. It's just beautiful out from Saturn. That's Earth. That right here is Earth. And yeah, if you've seen the original pale blue dot Sagan, we speak of just the realization, right, when we first started going to space, that this Earth is going to be tiny. It is tiny and a speck of dust, and all of our history and whatever we consider significant is just there. And there's an entire universe out there for us to expand to, and it's important to get to it. So the most significant image for me is this one. So this is an image of the solar boundary layer, right? This is the extent to which particles are still captured in the sun's gravitational field. This is the full extent of it. Up until a point, for us, our realm of what was accessible was just the Earth, and this would be your image of the world. But ever since we have had access to spaceflight, your realm of what is accessible to you as a species has been this. This is basically the Oort crowd. So around it you will have the solar boundary layer, which is more or less the thing that will act as a single body when you consider the galactic winds and the larger galactic atmosphere, so to speak. So when you look at this, there's a very clear flow separation around the sun because of this existing, and it's just a mark of it. There's asteroids all the way out. I think the Oort crowd is actually here. This extends far past that. But essentially, it's all of the matter that is still considered within the solar system. Why spaceflight? One, yeah, it's significant, but here's the other side of it, right? We as a species in the last couple decades have massively increased in our scale in the amount of energy we consume, the amount of energy we output, and the scale of change we can make, right? And you can compare this to a petri dish where you're going to have a couple species of organisms that are taking over and just influencing the entire balance of the palette that you're on. And this has happened before in Earth's history. Earth's atmosphere wasn't always oxygen rich. There were cyanobacteria that showed up through evolution and altered the entire atmosphere of the Earth by scrubbing the carbon dioxide from there. We are seeing a similar scale of a single species dominance on Earth, where we are with just even individual decisions able to upset the entire balance of the planet, right? And that's great power to have. But it also sort of says that the pot is boiling over, that Earth is finite, but our aspirations as a species are far more than that. And when we look at the resource constraints, we are only considering the Earth, right? And it is a very finite amount of resources that we are considering our access to. But if we are to keep scaling as a species and keep taking this forward, it's important for us to access all of the resources that are actually available to us within our physically accessible domain, which would be the entire Oort cloud here. Yeah, that's basically it in terms of why spaceflight for me personally. At Pixxel, we do hyperspectral Earth imaging. We just shipped 3 satellites to SpaceX that are launching in January. Looking forward to that. 3 more will go up in a subsequent launch, and we'll have a starting constellation of 6. Before this, we have launched 3 tech demos that have captured some test images just to prove out that hyperspectral imaging can be done from space, right? Right, this is one of our renders for the Firefly satellite. I was responsible for designing the physical structure for this. So, Effie was just out the past 2 days running some vibration testing on this structure. Just getting a little deeper into Pixxel, this is an example of a hyperspectral image compared to a visible image, right? What you'll notice here is like a visible image is roughly like just taking a pic with your smartphone from space. As long as you're in a capsule, you're capturing it, it's roughly going to look like this. It's just the visible spectra, right? Here you're seeing a very differentiated landscape. Another one is this. This is far more correlatable. This, I believe, is from one of our satellites, right? And you can see the vast amount of difference in just all of the things that are highlighted between these images. So what's happening here? Fundamentally, most of our vision relies on this RGB, red, green, blue, right? And we see in 3 wavelengths that we just merge together and see all of the shades that we do. It's a tiny fraction of the visible spectra. A lot of satellites already do multispectral imaging, which is they add a couple infrared bands, and these are carefully selected for things like crop detection or certain atmospheric bands or certain ocean bands, so that kind of thing, right? What we do is something called hyperspectral imaging. So when you have all of these data points, these instead form a smoother curve, and that curve is essentially your chemical spectra. So we are generating a chemical spectra of everything we are looking at. This is an example of like if you just have a visible image and you stack all of these hyperspectral images underneath it, right? Each of these pixels is one data point here across this line. And so when you lay it together, you have a full wavelength of whatever you're looking at. So vegetation might look like this, where it's reflecting certain wavelengths, it's absorbing in certain, and so it's going to have a very unique signature. Similarly, background soil alteration. So essentially, because we have all of these distinct spectra lined up back to back, right, it gives this relatively very fine signature that not only lets us tell whether it's vegetation, soil, minerals, etc., it also lets us tell you the exact crop species, the soil health, the nutrition levels, and all of this other data that you can capture from just the slight differences between each of these chemical spectra, right? So a slightly dry plant is going to have a slightly different chemical spectra as compared to something that is high humidity or healthier. Certain diseases cause blemishes that are easy to detect in the infrared spectra again. So that is also a useful indicator, and that would be all of the indicators we use for the agri-tech use case. Another example would be us looking for signatures of certain ores being present underground by the traces of the minerals that are visible on the surface. A couple more pixel images. This was Senegal, where we were experimenting with coastal habitat classification, biodiversity, just looking at certain crop species where wherever there might be like shelters and that kind of thing. So there's that. Crop variety identification in Saudi Arabia. This is a particularly mature use case. This has been possible even with multispectral to a certain extent, at least crop health. But we are able to tell you far more because of the data set that we have. It's just wider, deeper. And then industrial monitoring in Abu Dhabi, urban industrial. Essentially, you can even detect things like, hey, where's concrete, where's plastic roofs, where's like tin roofs, that kind of thing. And so you can map all of these signatures and try to get a really good understanding of what your city landscape looks like, what kind of, essentially coarse data sets you can get on urbanization and that kind of thing. There's also like use cases with obviously like pollutants, effluents, that kind of thing. So we have certain oil companies that come to us to monitor their pipelines, make sure there's no leaks, because by the time oil leaks are detected, not only have you like laid waste to that entire area, but also you've just wasted a lot of oil, right? And so with hyperspectral, you can immediately detect the slight changes in the spectra of the soil around it when it starts leaking, even before it's reached the surface. And so that really helps them curb it as early as possible and not get into legal trouble. But also similar for mining companies and runoffs they have in their quarries or their processing units. And so that has been a major use case for us. Certain banks, hedge funds, they've been buying data for this, for insurance predictions, that kind of thing, forecasting. There's a very interesting story with Planet Labs where there were these oil storage wells in Saudi Arabia, right? These huge tanks, drums, all across the landscape. And if you look at the orbit of the satellite, it is at a very specific angle, because of which at any local reference point is always going to fly over at the same time. So let's take 11:30 LTAN. We call it a LTAN. It's the point at which that latitude gets crossed. So at that LTAN, they were taking images every day, and what they realized was, because it's the same time, which means that the sun angle is the same, the shadows that were casted from the lids of the tanks onto the oil stored was meant to be consistent. And so they came up with the algorithm to detect the different levels of oils in each of the tanks and predict how much oil these guys actually have and what rates they are selling at, and do some forecasting there too. Another comparison image, multispectral and hyperspectral. Here in multispectral, you're just seeing a single dark blue body of water, but here we are able to get a little more insight into the runoffs that are occurring in this area. What we do is, actually, I think it's the next slide, yes. The Pixxel is essentially doing the highest resolution hyperspectral ever done yet by anybody. That is public. Militaries don't count, but like, yeah, 5-meter hyperspectral is the highest resolution done yet. Most of the hyperspectral missions so far have been 30 meters at best, and these are ton-class satellites. Firefly is a 50 kg class satellite that is able to do 5 meters just because of some cutting-edge technology we have in the sensors itself that lets us do this. This is the business pitch, I guess. But yeah. With migrations though, something that was interesting was the worldview images. So worldview 3, I believe, had like 0.25 meter, so 25 centimeter imagery that was used to track penguins and penguin migrations. Yeah. And maybe, I think giraffes, I don't remember, but penguins definitely. I'll send you the article, yeah. Yeah, here are the fireflies. This is what we've been working on, couple shots. We are now public with these. Just final stages, but these are solar panels that deploy outwards. This is the hyperspectral camera. This is it going into the thermo-vacuum chamber for vacuum testing. Essentially, we cycle it through the temperatures we expect in space, highs and lows, certain soaking, certain shocks, thermal shocks, and just making sure it can actually survive. I'll actually take that point forward. It's quite interesting in how spacecraft design works out, in the sense that, just mass as an example, right? Any input parameter that you take, every time that goes up by a slight amount, does 5 other domino effects that scale up into the spacecraft. For example, we just mentioned power, right? Suppose we are running a slightly inefficient algorithm where it's going to matter structurally. If it's a slightly inefficient, your power budget is going to be slightly larger. But it's not just that, because then you have the early LEOP phase, right, where the satellite is getting commissioned, where you don't know for sure if you're going to be able to reliably point at the sun. That's where you're essentially scaling your battery to be that size where it can run on its own power for a little bit, so your battery is slightly larger. Because of that, your solar power generation capacity is going to be slightly larger. Because the solar panels are slightly larger, your moment of inertia is going to be slightly larger, because of which your control system is going to scale up slightly more. Now, if your control systems is larger, again, your LEOP phase, you will want power for that. So you're going to, again, go into the same iteration loop again. Likewise, because your overall mass on all of these fronts has gone up, you're going to require to carry slightly more fuel to keep the spacecraft compensating for its drag for up to 5 years. So again, you're looping that back in and scaling the system up again for that. That's more added mass control system. You do the same loop. And so every single input that you have has an exponential impact on some other thing. So yeah, where AI comes in, this is Aurora. This is our software stack, our software platform that is now actually open to users. So you guys can sign up, log in, pull satellite images from a host of existing satellites as well as ours. We have some test images already on this, but the bulk of the images will come from our commercial, like Fireflies are our commercial scale product that will generate this data. So once they launch, you'll have a huge flood of data into this software, right? And this is essentially exploration analysis platform. So this is Indranagar right here, where from a multispectral satellite data source, we are mapping two spectral graphs. And as you can see, they are fairly coarse. But when we take our first images with Firefly, you will have a much finer spectra and understanding of all of this. This is area near the Seafridge Air Force Base, where again there's some water quality index coverage that's going on. And again, these are known bands, known models that have been developed on this multispectral satellite data stack. But hyperspectral data just hasn't been available for anybody, so people haven't built a huge number of models around it. Few people have. So the EO-1 spacecraft, which I'll come to soon, was one of the first demonstrators from the NASA side to do it. There have been a couple European missions, one Indian mission that has done hyperspectral, but for some reason it's just technology that hasn't been pursued very well. There had been attempts but from the NASA climate and Earth monitoring program that just refuses to get funded. So yeah. So this was the story of the Earth Observing 1 mission, which was one of the first missions to actually demonstrate hyperspectral imaging. It had an instrument called HISIS, I believe, that was this was like a 2-ton class satellite with a huge hyperspectral imager that was just reaching 30 meters. And this was back in like 2000, 2001. EO-1 was a part of this new millennium program that NASA had to attempt to build spacecraft faster, easier, cheaper. This was one of many attempts, but there was a couple other satellites along with this in this program. EO-1 was one of the most interesting. It had a couple things new other than hyperspectral. It was one of the first satellites to have fiber optics running between its electronics to be able to quickly transfer data in between. It had a Teflon plasma thruster, which was new for its time. And it had an onboard AI that was actually operating the satellite and planning certain imaging as it ran through its mission. So this was one of the articles. I highly recommend reading this, by the way. It's a very interesting article. But one of the instances was where there was a volcanic eruption somewhere in Congo, and the ground team was interested in capturing the phenomena, right, and making sure people have access to that data. And they decided to go and task EO-1 to go capture that data, only to find that when they opened sort of their data set, whatever, they discovered that EO-1 had already taken an image of it autonomously, because it detected a huge change in what this area normally looks like versus kuch galat dikh raha hai, and already taken a couple images that were already available for them to study. Even the imaging limits and like why not image continuously also comes from that. This thing of like, yeah, you can build a continuously imaging satellite, and if you had the resources to, if you had the launch mass to, you would. But like basically what you're doing is, if you're asking for continuous imaging versus targeted imaging, you're essentially asking for a 50 kg satellite versus a 150 kg satellite for no reason. So yeah. Firefly uses a bipropellant system. So it is supplied by Dawn Aerospace karke company. I believe that is public, so I can speak to that. But it is propene and N2O as a fuel and oxidizer combination. It's meant to be like green propellants to replace things called hypergolics. So back in the day, hypergolics, it's still used, even ISRO uses them in fact, are these compounds that whenever they come into contact with each other, they'll spontaneously combust, right? And that was it's pretty high efficiency. So that was what was used for most of spaceflight, but they are really tough to handle. It's like very finicky because you really don't want to breathe that in. It's very cancerous. It's quite toxic. So yeah, right now the industry is trying to, one, bend the regulations, make the entire operation simpler and that kind of thing by going towards these green propellants that are going to be comparable efficiency but not be as hazardous. There's a very nice book, by the way, about it, Ignition, by, do you remember the name?
J.D. Clark.
Yeah.
J.D. Clark.
Yeah, which goes into all of the chemistry explorations that the US Air Force and NASA and all of these folks had done back in the 70s and 80s to figure out, hey, what propellants work across the board for the industry. And there's some very, very interesting propellants that eat metal, plastic, like all kinds of things, like very corrosive stuff. But one of my very first like space gigs was out in Surat. We were making model rockets where we were cooking up this rocket candy, as it's called, in the back of an abandoned mall and setting it on fire and then making gunpowder, playing catch with it. It was pretty fun. Cool. So yeah, just AI in general. I mean, Starlink's coming online. That is a major thing. A lot of AI is also used in routing these constellations, adjusting orbits. It's very hard for human operators to keep maintaining all of these orbits simultaneously. So ML plays some part in that in terms of mapping all of these orbits. Cool. That's largely it, but I'm just going to skip to the next section, the sci-fi future. So if we are okay with the current state of like spaceflight stuff right now, what I'm going to do is just delve into a couple sci-fi concepts that we find very interesting and we see as the future for the spaceflight industry to keep going. Yeah, my version of how we end up going multistellar. Multiplanetary, it's like well explained, done, ho jayega, sabko pata hai, but like multistellar is more interesting. Because that's the unproven stuff, right? Multiplanetary to kar it's like more or less possible, like it's not that bad. And it's been talked about enough. Everybody knows what the pathway is, if not, even if it's not happened yet. The physics have been there, the tech roughly has been there, so it's fine. Going to get into less realistic. I mean, it is realistic, just more far out stuff. But starting with space manufacturing. So this is something Sudarshan wanted me to really talk about. So, okay. So the thing is, so far in space, most of the value proposition in space has been from the merit of it just being a really tall tower. That's how space is used. You use the tall tower for communications or imaging or that kind of thing and just getting that kind of field of view, but that is essentially it. And as people who are desperate to keep advancing in space, we have to create value in space, and we are trying to find any excuse to keep going to space. So one of the more promising sides of this is just kickstarting any way to start manufacturing anything in space, anything high value enough to justify the entire cost proposition. So one of the most interesting stories surrounding this was Z-Plan optic fibers. Basically, on Wall Street, a lot of the trading is done in very near real time, right, with a lot of automated systems. And they are constantly trying to sync with the servers for like whatever, the NYSE or whatever, and trying to get their money in as quick as possible. And basically, it actually matters how quickly you can get it just to beat out your competitor, right? And so people have been working on optimizing the entire compute stack behind it, the entire transmission stack behind it, and then again the literal internet between these two things. At that point, you're just getting capped by the speed of light and optic fiber. So how do you improve that? And it turns out that on Earth, when you have optic fibers that are manufactured under gravity, the crystal structures that form because of gravity cause these defects to appear in the optic fibers. But if you send it to the ISS and manufacture it in microgravity, near zero gravity, you get near continuous fibers that are very smooth and very low. But 2014, these guys went up. This is terrestrial 1G fabrication, microgravity fabrication, and the way you extrude these optic fibers out, it's far purer in terms of, because gravity is causing all of the mass of that to sag down and cause those crystals to naturally form. But this was one of those breakthrough use cases where something that was manufactured in space was actually that much higher quality. So there's that. Similarly, this has also been done for some chip manufacturing and that kind of experiments. There was a space shuttle experiment that had a shield full of chips that was pointed out with the robotic arm into space, and then there were some processes run on it because EUV is already done in a vacuum chamber, and it's quite finicky and expensive to pump all of that air out to that degree to be able to get the purity of the medium versus if you manage to do that in space. There's other challenges, 15 other challenges, but that might be a pathway where, yeah, manufacturing chips in space could be viable and get you higher purity chips. So there's that. Another very interesting use case was biofabrication. So, organ 3D printing has been experimented with on Earth, right? And okay, just to clarify, it is essentially using these, I forget what it was called, but essentially fluid mediums to suspend the cells, and essentially using stem cells to replicate and print cells in a sequence along a line and form a single layer of tissue, and then keep layering that on to form complete tissues, right? But there's a problem on Earth, which is that whenever you form these structures, under gravity, these collapse naturally, and the fluid has not been working well enough to support these structures on Earth. So what ended up happening was, again, and all of space manufacturing, this aspect is essentially focusing on what if you are able to eliminate gravity as a variable out of your manufacturing process, right? Just the advancement to being able to remove, let's say, the air medium or temperature alone has unlocked so many other manufacturing processes that were edge cases before we had access to that, right? Up until then, you're just dealing with whatever's available to you as a medium on Earth. And when you can remove gravity as a variable, you're actually able to print a lot of these organs or tissues that do not actually collapse because it's literally in microgravity. And so this was an experiment with Redwire Space, which had a biofabrication module on the ISS, and they managed to print a piece of heart tissue on the ISS. And a huge future use case could be the ability to print full organs in space as replacement, printed from your own cells. It's not even from anybody else's cells, which causes those compatibility issues and all of that. It's from your own cells. There's little chance of rejection, and you can just order a new liver and it's going to beam down from space. Yeah. So yeah, again, another hopeful use case that would let us continue creating a, like, see, the thing is, the use case itself is interesting enough, but for us, we are more interested in making this use case happen so that we have a reason to build space stations. Like, we are itching to, so like, kuch to chahiye. But yeah, obviously there's regular 3D printing also, if they also do that. But what's interesting about this, I find, is that the fact that you're going to have resupply missions, every 2 months, let's say, is where you have a cargo capsule going to the ISS, maybe a little sparse than that. And so the fact that you can just have a filament that you're sending to ISS every once in a while and uploading your blueprints for whatever tools that you're going to require on the go, right? And your data has no mass. It's easier to uplink than to send a new tool to the ISS. And so I like 3D printing on the ISS is just one of those huge lever use cases for additive manufacturing. It's pretty cool. I believe this was like a socket for some wrench or like tightening something that they had just printed off the cuff, but pretty interesting. A future extension of this use case would be to have satellites that can launch just as the unit itself, and then let's say print a huge aperture antenna for themselves once they are in space, by having a combination of these, again, just having some filament or robotic arm and layering these on and, to form a truss structure with its own antenna mesh. In a sense, yes. Yeah. You can still have a tiny satellite that is providing the power, compute, etc., and print a huge antenna for itself, and instead of messing with extremely expensive and very complicated deployables that we usually have to deal with. Yeah. What's like my concern with this is just that the satellite is tiny in comparison, so the control system's moment of inertia is just going to be a mess with this. It's too large, but yeah, it's a very interesting direction to go into. All right. Obviously, this, by the way, extends to all sorts of important, like multiplanetary settlement goals, where you can land a spacecraft, have it start printing its own structures, build habitats, build other structures, whatever you need there. And a very important use case that we hope will be a thing in the future. Another very good example is like China wants to start exploring building kilometer class spaceships in space, assembled in space. So you launch multiple modules, you put those together, you manufacture print, sheet metal, whatever these structures out and build in spaceships, essentially ships that are never returning to Earth. They are going to continue living in space, so you can build them ultra lightweight. Important like comparison to note is like the Apollo capsule had walls that were literally paper thin. You could puncture it with your finger. It was that thin. Yeah, it was because it was meant to be a in-space structure. It was purely meant to be a space structure. It was never going to come back. The lunar module, it was going to be abandoned in space, and so it was a one-way trip. And what you can build for a one-way trip, like it's not going to have to deal with all of the atmospheric loads again. It still had to survive launch. If you are building in space, you don't even need to do that. You can just grab the raw material, build it in space, and then what are your loads? Just microgravity and maybe some torques and that kind of thing, centrifugal forces. But other than that, not much. And so you can build very, very ultra lightweight structures that are very easy to propel deeper into space and go wherever you like. Next up, asteroids. Asteroid materials and just materials in general. Asteroids are just rocks, whatever. But rocks in general are very available through the solar system in every corner. And looking at these manufacturing use cases, but also looking at future settlement goals, you would want to capitalize on all of these resources that are already available in space. In fact, if you want to look, there's a website called Asterank where you can look at all of the asteroids and their relative values and how feasible they are to mine. And it will tell you exactly where it is, the estimated profits you would make, the kind of delta V you need to get there, and yeah, how viable it is. So this one is literally ranked by most cost effective. And top of that list is asteroid Psyche. And so NASA recently sent a mission to asteroid Psyche. This guy, it's like a modified geostationary satellite bus that they use for this mission. I believe, yeah, this is the optical terminal there. They use optical communication on this spacecraft. And it has a bunch of these instruments to go verify whether the asteroid is made out of what we think it's made out of, right? And important plug with Pixxel is that Hyperspectral is particularly good at looking at these chemical signatures. We do it for mining, where we look at traces of these ores and try to estimate how much would be present below the Earth, right? And something that was intent in picking hyperspectral as a vertical was the ability to equip future deep space missions with these sensor suites and be able to go and prospect asteroids and essentially get a good guesstimate of how much minerals are present within it and whether it's worth mining, so that future missions can go and start extracting resources from there. Right. So people always try to go for like हम लोग gold platinum लाएंगे, and that is not what you would want to do. Essentially, bringing asteroid material back to Earth is usually considered a step that is going to break that cost proposition and is usually not worth it. What you would want to do is use these materials for further in-space manufacturing and to keep setting up this industrial supply chain on orbit. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, recently just they had been working on this for a while, but they published the results on their ability to make solar cells and certain other components from lunar regoliths. So they started with regolith simulants and managed to build a solar cell wafer out of it and on Earth. And plan is to equip their future lunar landers with this tech to be able to build its own solar cells. They are also heavily relying on ISRO. So what we call this is ISRO, in-space resource utilization. And so a major use case for ISRO is propellants, because propellants are some of the most valuable things you can get deep in space, right? And so just the ability to extract water, like split it into hydrogen, oxygen, or just use it as water propellant is a pretty important capability. But they had also been considering ISRO to get what was it? Their fuel cells. I believe it was hydrolox fuel cells that they wanted to power, that kind of thing. ISRO also extends to like when you talk about the Mars missions and your ability to literally use the soil to farm or to use as radiation protection or to start extracting minerals from it and use it in your construction. All of that counts as ISRO. Yeah. So yeah, asteroid mining, cool images. So yeah, this was Deep Space Industries, one of the companies that was very early on one of the flagship startups for asteroid mining, but they ended up going bankrupt and were sold for their water propulsion technology. But yeah, the thing is, every time somebody has tried to attack asteroid mining as the use case that you're trying to build a product for, it doesn't really work. And so the more regulated approach has been to go build a company doing something that can provide direct earth value and then keep scaling it into aerospace, just a general purpose aerospace company that can go do these things in the future, which is sort of in the mindset we are at with Pixxel. Yeah, some asteroid mining concepts from the Kurzgesagt video. By the way, there's a very good Kurzgesagt video about asteroid mining that you should absolutely check out. That clarifies a lot of these concepts and like the pieces of the chain on how do you actually bring it back, how do you actually transport it, how do you actually mine it, yeah, all sorts of process it, all sorts of things. So yeah. Moving on, how do you use all of this? Suppose you have done all of this, you have the industrial capability, you're mining tons of minerals all through the solar system. Why and what do you do with it? So first thing, O'Neill cylinders. Look, planets are okay, but just because we are from a planet doesn't mean we should go to another planet. It's like a little too repetitive. The idea goes, there was this interview between Gerard O'Neill and Asimov where they discussed the idea of planetary chauvinism in the sense that the idea that just because we evolved on a planet, our concept of how we occupy areas in space is to go to another planet and take over the next planet and the next planet. And that is not necessarily true because you can sort of build your own habitats in space, right? And where that matters is using planets is inefficient. When you're going to a new planet, you're only settling its surface and all of the actual material of the planet is just left underneath. Versus if you get to mining the planet and extracting the resources and building these thin shell cylinders, O'Neill cylinders effectively, you can maximize your surface area by a huge amount as compared to just the surface of the planet. And that's a lot more area to host populations. We do, apartments are basically that, but on the ground. And so this is the idea of instead of going from one cave, one naturally occurring cave to another naturally occurring cave, you're essentially choosing to go wherever you like and then build skyscrapers there. And that is roughly the analogy you would put. And yeah, suppose you have that kind of industrial capability to be generating that much resource, that much power, you can build O'Neill cylinders of whatever kind you like. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be these cramped, like just apartment blocks in a circle wala O'Neill cylinders. There have been concepts to literally build like ocean worlds, national parks, lakes, different biomes, that kind of thing, and just really maximize and really flex your capability as what you can build as human beings. And yeah, these are rotating space colonies. You could have millions of these around a single planet. The idea is to surround Earth in so many O'Neill cylinders it looks like Saturn's rings all over again. And transiting between these O'Neill cylinders is also quite easy in terms of just orbit phasing. And so you can have a pretty bustling economy all around it. This is from Blue Origin's presentation. Jeff Bezos has a really good presentation about the long-term path for Blue Origin themselves. Important tangent there is that he studied at Princeton. Okay, I've been speaking for too long. Give me a second. Okay. Princeton University, right? And at Princeton, O'Neill was one of his professors, and they ended up meeting. And somehow it just so happened that one of his students ended up becoming the richest man in the world through other sources, and then ended up funding his idea very long in the future. So yeah, it was complete coincidence, and it's awesome that we get to have that future. The thing is, I mean, every year Jeff Bezos used to sell like $1 billion of Amazon stock and fund Blue Origin. It started out as a think tank. They explored very wide-ranging things actually. They looked at like scramjets, space scramjets kind of thing. They looked at space elevators. They looked at launch cannons, that kind of thing. They did all of the exploration to figure out, hey, how do you enable this future of O'Neill cylinders and like properly populating space. And they end up arriving at rockets a little aram se, but yeah, they did their B1 engine, they did some jet-based hops on a lander that isn't very often like seen. But then eventually they got to New Shepard, they took their own sweet time with that. Then they got to New Glenn, they took their time with that. Right, they recently changed their CEOs and it's been kicked into a higher gear. But up until recently, it was known as the place where SpaceXers go to retire. So, yeah. But yeah, I really like their long-term vision. And like one of the main points of this talk is essentially just the idea that you would want to move all of the heavy industry you can into space, into near Earth orbit, and essentially zone Earth as a residential / natural park. The idea is that, look, Earth is the only confirmed source of life we know that has existed. This is the reference point. And we can't keep messing with its biosphere hard enough that it actually caps our ability to figure out, hey, how life evolved here, right? But also, yeah, just in case anything happens to us, we want that cradle to be safe and to be able to evolve new life forms. And now that we know the conditions were right here. And yeah, so yeah, basically it's like the most interesting planet to study. It's the only one with any biodiversity, so you would want to protect that. And so yeah, zone Earth as a residential and / natural park. Forget even residential, natural park. That's the idea. And I think that's a pretty beautiful vision. So yeah. Cool. These were some Russian, back in the Soviet era, concepts for O'Neill cylinders. They used to hook up two so that you can have opposite moments cancel each other out so that it doesn't spin too brutally. And yeah, either nuclear or solar power generation on it, and you can keep scaling that. But that comes to the next point, which is power, Dyson Swarms. So you might have heard of the concept of just generating solar power from Earth orbit, right? The argument being that, hey, atmospheric losses are just unnecessary and we can just go to space instead and be closer to pure direct sunlight, get way higher efficiency, there's no clouds, whatever, and you beam power back to Earth wherever you want to create a hotspot, and yeah, that as a source of power. The next step goes, what if you were even closer to the sun? And so this is the concept of putting a constellation of satellites effectively in orbit around the sun, and you do one ring and then another ring and then you keep going until you have a cluster of satellites all around the sun that are nearly blocking it out, but let's not block it out. People have, the earlier concept was the idea of a Dyson sphere, which you might have heard of, which is like a proper solid envelope around it. Dyson swarms are like the happier medium there, which I prefer personally, which is essentially you spam a lot of Starlink class satellite, like the way Starlink goes, just spam satellites all around the sun and have massive power generation capability. And a couple things you can do with this, you can beam it to other places in the solar system. You can use it for local mining and that kind of thing. You can maybe do materials processing there because your power source is the sun. You're around it. It's like a nuclear reactor for free, and you're just building the collection device around it, right? And so there's plenty of concepts. There's also the Dyson Sphere program. It's a factory building, Factorio style game where you can build your own Dyson swarm. So that's pretty fun. But yeah, this is what the individual components look like. Essentially, tiny pucks of satellites with huge solar sails that can generate the power and beam it translated to other destinations, or even this is in context of us building Dyson Swarms, but the original or like the origin of the idea was the Kardashev scale, essentially saying that hey, if there's life out there, how can we detect it all the way from here? And we suspected that hey, their star also is producing a lot of energy, and if I was them, I would try to harvest it. So maybe they are trying to harvest it. How would they harvest it? They might be building these collection devices, satellites, something made out of matter around the sun, their sun, that is at least blocking some of it out. And maybe with our telescopes, we can look at the occlusion there and try to figure out, hey, is there any biosignature around this star? Yeah. So that's Dyson Swarms themselves. And again, this is free energy. This is a lot of energy, and there's plenty to do with it, right? There's all of the manufacturing stuff. There's the idea of accelerating ships using power beaming from here. There is the entire, I guess, saying of disassemble Mercury, which is you disassemble Mercury into its raw bits so that you can use all of its matter to build either more swarms or spaceships or whatever else you like, but disassemble Mercury, get rid of it. And it's ours. As I said, the solar system is ours. Yeah. So far, nobody stopped us yet. So far, we'll see when we deal with that. But yeah. Next, extension of this is Matryoshka brains. Essentially, if you take a Dyson swarm, well, originally a Dyson sphere, and instead of just using it for power generation, you also build a layer of compute around it, the entire sun powering a single supercomputer. That is known as a Matryoshka brain. It comes from Matryoshka dolls and like the layers of shells around it, and basically in the swarm concept, you would build layers of Dyson swarms around it, and the star is a data center. Yes, absolutely. Right? It is a single power source for this entire connected web of compute. Not only could you have, yeah, as you said, GPT-10, essentially you could have a single super intelligence that's powered by a star, right? And eventually even multiple stars, but like your speed of light beaming is like very slow. But between stars, like speed of light is almost like nothing. It's too slow. So you'll eventually have like civilizations lose touch with each other and form different branches. But that's a different path of sci-fi that I'll come back from. Matryoshka brains, yeah, essentially the fact that you could have a super intelligence running on all of these simultaneously and then beaming that as almost like commands, telecommands to all of the little bots and stuff in the solar system is a pretty cool idea. But yeah, phase 3, panspermia. Essentially the idea that, hey, life idhar apan confirm kiya hai, let's make sure we take a backup of it everywhere possible. There's also the concept of panspermia vaults. In panspermia, that is, yes, life from an asteroid or something, koi to cell aaya and it came onto Earth, and then that's how life began. That's the other way around of panspermia. But we don't know that has happened yet, but we probably should go do that. So the idea is that you grab a couple asteroids and you put a couple bacteria on them, but instead of asteroids, you do ships. And a couple ways you can do this. So there's a whole set of arguments to say that, hey, if we have any shot of detecting this life, then we might end up contaminating it with our bacteria, and then we won't be able to tell if this is terrestrial or extraterrestrial life kind of thing. That happens with Mars and those kinds of concepts. Ki yaar Mars mat jao, pollute kar loge kind of thing. But like the idea here is that it's, if we are stuck in the intersection of is maybe finding future extraterrestrial life later, we might lose the ability to get some life backups out of the planet, right? And so the more conservative idea would be to build panspermia vaults, which would be this, let's say, chamber of biomass and certain hardened microbes and that kind of thing, and maybe even like eggs of different animals and that kind of thing that you place onto different celestial bodies, whatever you can access. And in case we are forced to send a signal of end of civilization on Earth, you can activate that, and then they'll just panspermia the planet and release the whatever culture and make sure that life can exist in other places in case we lose the game. But that is one form of backup. The other one just goes that screw that, let's do it anyway. Spread life to as many planets as possible because life is just existing. We don't know if there's more out there, but let's make sure it exists without us. And it is almost a duty from an evolutionary standpoint for us to be placing those outside and taking backups.